The story of the famous Camden, Maine lobster boat Betselma is one that has occupied much of my life over the past 6 years. During that time, I've searched through decades of newspaper archives, interviewed former captains and local historians, uncovered long forgotten photographs, and collected stories that, had they not been written down, might have disappeared forever. History has always fascinated me, whether it's preserving an old artifact, documenting a forgotten story, or restoring a wooden boat. I've found myself drawn to things that slowly erase. When I'm not restoring the Betselma and the Quint's famous shark fishing boat, the Orca, I'm usually chasing another piece of history, much like Indiana Jones. This documentary, however, isn't about the Orca rebuild project. It's about the boat that came before. This is the story of the Betselma, a story of craftsmanship, hard work, family, and a little wooden lobster boat that spent more than 70 years earning her place in Maine's maritime history. So rather than me welcoming you to this story, I think it's only fitting that the man who built her introduces you to her story. Captain Ralph Worcester.
Welcome aboard the Betselma.
Like any great story, the Betselma story has a beginning. That beginning takes us to the picturesque harbor town of Camden, Maine. Nestled along the shores of Penobscot Bay, Camden has long been defined by the sea. For generations, fishing boats, schooners, windjammers, and lobster boats have come and gone from its harbor, making boat building as much a part of the town's identity as the granite hills rising behind it. It was here during the winter of 1943 that the first spark of the Betselma was born. The idea didn't begin with blueprints. It began with a simple wood carving. Fred Worcester, a World War I veteran and skilled craftsman, carved the side profile of a wooden boat from a piece of wood. His younger brother, Ralph Worcester, saw something more than a carving. He saw a boat. Inspired by Fred's vision, Ralph sat down and began drawing plans. Those drawings would soon become the foundation for one of Camden's most recognizable lobster boats. Once the plans were complete, Ralph began lofting the hull lines at Camden Shipbuilding and Marine Railway. Coincidentally enough, while not being the same Camden, the USS Indianapolis was built in Camden, New Jersey, which I think is fitting, and perhaps fate. At the time, Ralph was 41 years old, Fred was 46. Neither man could have imagined that the little boat they were building would still be making history more than 80 years later. From the beginning, the Betselma was designed to be different. Ralph chose white oak as a primary construction material, a timber renowned for its incredible strength, durability, and natural resistance to rot. For centuries, white oak had been the preferred wood of master shipbuilders. Ralph knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't merely building another lobster boat. He was building one meant to last. And last she did. Long before the Betselma ever touched the water, Ralph had already earned a reputation as an accomplished seaman. He had captained the schooner Wildfire, and during one violent hurricane, successfully saved her from being driven onto the rocks. He understood boats. More importantly, he understood the sea. The Betselma's design remains one of her most fascinating characteristics. Unlike the vast majority of Maine lobster boats, she wasn't a traditional down east hull, nor was she a true Cape Island or Novi design. Instead, Ralph combined elements of both. Forward, she carried the full buoyant bow of a down east lobster boat, allowing her to ride comfortably through rough seas. Aft, her lines narrowed into a sleeker shape more commonly associated with a Cape Island boat, reducing drag and improving speed. The result was something remarkably unique. Perhaps the only true hybrid of its kind, a lobster boat capable of carrying heavy loads while still maintaining impressive speed and seaworthiness. Even today, her hull is unlike anything else I've ever encountered. One of the great mysteries surrounding the Betselma is how little documentation survives from her construction. Not a single photograph exists showing her being built. No progress photos. There's no launch photographs. There's nothing. Even more remarkable, Once construction was complete and the Betselma was launched into the icy waters of Penobscot Bay in January of 1945, the original blueprints were deliberately burned one night. Ralph and Fred threw them into a burn barrel. Why? No one knows for certain. Perhaps they didn't want copies made. Perhaps they wanted the design to remain uniquely theirs. Whatever the reason, the plans disappeared forever. Another mystery followed shortly after. Although the Betselma entered service in 1945, Ralph didn't officially register with the United States Coast Guard until the 1970s. That, too, is a story deserving of its own documentary. For now, it's enough to say that there were reasons, and they made perfect sense once the full story came to light later. Powering the Betselma was a 6-cylinder Scripps diesel engine. Reliable, simple, and powerful. Exactly what a hard-working Maine lobster boat required. Yet it wasn't the engine that made the Betselma special. It was how she'd been built. During construction, Ralph developed a remarkable, efficient method of steam bending her frames. Rather than steaming ribs and immediately forcing them into the keel, as was traditional practice, Ralph built custom jigs that allowed each rib to be steamed, bent precisely to shape, and left to dry before being installed. Only after the wood had fully set was each rib permanently fitted into the keel. The process required patience, it required planning, but it produced incredibly accurate framing while placing far less stress on the timbers themselves. For its time, it was an ingenious approach. In fact, during the restoration of the Betselma's hull, I adopted the very same technique. Some traditions are too good to be forgotten. The original blueprints may have vanished into the burn barrel nearly 80 years ago, but that didn't stop me from trying to recreate them. Using hundreds of photographs, measurements taken directly from the hull, and careful comparison with surviving wooden lobster boats of the time, I produced a new set of drawings that closely represent what Ralph originally created. They are, admittedly, a reconstruction, but they also serve another purpose. They reveal something remarkable. When compared against the hull of the original Warlock, the vessel that became the Orca and Jaws, the similarities are extraordinary. The shear, the proportions, the underwater lines. It's easy to understand why the Betselma felt less like luck and more like fate. By the time the Betselma slid down the ways into the frigid waters of Penobscot Bay in January of 1945, the Second World War was entering its final months. Across the Atlantic, Allied forces were pushing steadily into Germany. In the Pacific, American troops continued their island-hopping campaign towards Japan. Even along the rocky coast of Maine, the effects of the war were impossible to ignore. Coastal blackouts had become commonplace only a few years earlier, and reports of German submarines operating in the North Atlantic had left many fishermen keeping one eye on their work and the other on the horizon. For Ralph Worcester, however, the war had another effect. It meant there was work to be done. Like generations of Maine fishermen before him, Ralph made his living from the sea, lobstering during the warmer months and scalping during the winter. The Betselma quickly proved exactly what she had been built to be, a dependable working boat. She never intended to be flashy. She was never built for luxury. Every curve of her hull, every timber, every fastener had a purpose: to make a living. It wasn't long before the Betselma earned a reputation around Camden Harbor. She rode differently than most lobster boats. The broad bow gave her a comfortable ride when the seas turned rough, while her narrow stern allowed her to move through the water with surprising speed. Older fishermen often joked that if you couldn't keep up with the Betselma, you probably needed a better boat. They weren't entirely wrong. She developed a reputation for being both fast and remarkably seaworthy, a rare combination in a wooden lobster boat. Those qualities weren't accidental. They were the direct result of Ralph's design. As accomplished as Ralph was as a boat builder, those who knew him remembered him for something else entirely: his character. Ralph Worcester wasn't a man who sought attention. He wasn't interested in recognition or rewards. He believed a man's reputation should be built the same way as a wooden boat, one piece at a time, one honest day's work after another. He possessed a dry sense of humor, a quick wit, and a habit of turning even the simplest conversations into life lessons. To many around Camden, Ralph wasn't simply a fisherman. He was something of a philosopher, not because he spoke often, but because when he did, people listened. One lesson in particular stayed with those who worked alongside him.
It came after another lobsterman accused Ralph of stealing his lobster pots. The accusation led to a confrontation on the docks, a confrontation that nearly turned violent before Ralph stepped in. After tempers had cooled, Ralph turned to his young deckhand and offered advice that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Never steal from a man's livelihood. Borrow without permission if you have to, but make it right when you do. Always make it right. Simple words, yet they perfectly reflected the code which Ralph lived by. Along the waterfront, a man's reputation was worth more than the boat he captained. Trust was everything. Once lost, it was nearly impossible to earn back. As months passed, Ralph settled into a familiar rhythm to every Maine lobsterman. Long days began well before sunrise. The Betselma would leave the harbor in darkness, her diesel engine echoing across Camden as she steamed towards strings of lobster pots stretching across Penobscot Bay. Some mornings the sea was calm enough to resemble polished glass. Other mornings, fog rolled so thick across the bay that the neighboring boats vanished only a few hundred feet away. The work itself never changed. Haul the trap, measure the lobsters, rebait, reset, move on to the next buoy, then repeat the process again and again and again. It was physically demanding work, but Ralph wouldn't have traded it for anything. Like every working boat, the Betselma accumulated stories almost immediately. Some were funny, some were unbelievable. Others have become part of Maine maritime folklore. Over the years, tales of Ralph Worcester and his longtime deckhand Marianne Taft would spread well beyond Camden Harbor. Stories involving runaway goats, ridiculous lobster races, bank robberies that never happened, rum runners, and even a wartime encounter with what was believed to be a German U-boat. Whether every detail happened exactly as remembered is almost beside the point, because every harbor has storytellers, and every legendary boat accumulates legends of its own. The Betselma was no exception. Many of those stories deserve to be told in their entirety, but those are stories for another day. Today, our focus remains on the boat herself. For the next several decades, the Betselma did exactly what Ralph built her to do. She worked, day after day, season after season, year after year. She became as much a part of the Camden Harbor as the windjammers anchored offshore or the church steeple overlooking the town. She wasn't famous. She wasn't historic. Not yet. She was simply another hard-working lobster boat, and perhaps that's exactly what made her extraordinary. By the 1950s, Camden Harbor was changing. The fishing fleet was still busy, but each summer more and more visitors began arriving to experience the beauty of Maine's rugged coastline. The schooners sailed daily from the harbor, artists filled the streets with easels, and tourists wandered the docks hoping to catch a glimpse of authentic coastal life. Ralph Worcester saw an opportunity in 1946. The Betselma had already proven herself as a dependable lobster boat, but she could become something more. Without sacrificing her identity as a working vessel, Ralph began offering sightseeing cruises around Camden Harbor and Penobscot Bay. Passengers weren't boarding a polished excursion yacht or a luxury cruise boat. They were stepping aboard a genuine Maine lobster boat, a vessel that had earned her living from the sea. For many visitors, it was their first opportunity to experience life aboard a working wooden boat. For Ralph, it was simply another day's work. The Betselma quickly became one of Camden's most recognizable attractions. Ralph had a gift of storytelling, whether he was pointing out lighthouses scattered along the coast, recounting local history, or simply sharing stories about life on the water. Passengers came away feeling they had experienced something authentic. They weren't simply taking a boat ride, they were spending an afternoon with the true Maine lobsterman. The name Betselma itself reflected what mattered most to Ralph. Rather than choosing a traditional nautical name, he combined the names of his two daughters, Betsy and Thelma. The result was a name like any other, simple, personal, and unmistakably his own. It was a fitting tribute from a father whose greatest creation wasn't simply a wooden boat. It was the family that inspired her name. For nearly a quarter of a century, Ralph captained the Betselma himself. He continued operating his sightseeing cruises while remaining a familiar face around Camden Harbor, introducing thousands of visitors to the beauty of Penobscot Bay. By the time he retired in 1969, the Betselma had become much more than a lobster boat. She had become a Camden institution. Fortunately, Ralph's retirement did not mark the end of the Betselma's story. Captain Fred Bell purchased the vessel and chose to continue the tradition Ralph had established. Rather than changing the boat's purpose, Bell carried forward the sightseeing cruises that had become synonymous with the Betselma. For another 4 years, passengers continued boarding the familiar wooden lobster boat, many never realizing they were stepping aboard a vessel that had already become a piece of Maine maritime history. In 1973, ownership passed once again, this time the captain Alan Talbot. Although Talbot's ownership was relatively brief, he ensured the Betselma remained active on the waters she had known since 1945. By now, nearly 30 years had passed since Ralph and Fred Worcester had launched her in the Penobscot Bay. The Betselma continued doing what she had always done, working. Then in 1976, another chapter began. Captain Les Becks purchased the Betselma. Les was no stranger to historic vessels. Before acquiring the Betselma, he owned and operated two of Maine's most celebrated tall ships, the Mercantile and Grace Bailey. His appreciation for traditional wooden vessels made him an ideal caretaker. Over the next 36 years, Les would devote himself to preserving the Betselma, introducing countless visitors to Camden Harbor, while ensuring the old lobster boat remained exactly as she had always been, authentic, working, and alive. It proved to be one of the longest periods of continuous ownership in the Betselma's remarkable history. Looking back today, it's remarkable to realize how fortunate the Betselma truly was. Many wooden lobster boats built during the 1940s disappeared decades ago. Some were abandoned, others were scrapped. Many simply rotted away after their usefulness had ended. The Betselma survived because each generation of owners chose preservation over replacement. Ralph built her. Fred Bell carried on her tradition. Alan Talbot kept her working. Les Becks devoted more than 3 decades to her care. Without each of them, the Betselma almost certainly would not exist today. And without their stewardship, there would be no story left to tell. For more than 3 decades, Les cared for the Betselma as though she were a member of his own family. He understood that owning a wooden boat wasn't simply about maintenance, it was about stewardship. Unlike fiberglass boats, wooden boats demand constant attention. A loose fastener ignored today becomes a leaking plank tomorrow. A small leak becomes a rotten frame. A rotten frame becomes structural damage. Wooden boats reward those willing to care for them, and punish those who neglect them. Les understood that better than anyone. His dedication ensured that the Betselma survived long enough for another generation to appreciate her history. One of the most dramatic moments in the Betselma's later life came unexpectedly. While operating in Camden Harbor, the schooner Roseway collided with the Betselma on her port side. The impact left significant damage to her hull. For many aging wooden boats, an accident like that marks the end. Repairs become too costly, owners walk away, another historic vessel quietly disappears. Fortunately for the Betselma, that was not her fate. She was hauled from the water and entrusted to the skilled hands of local shipwright Alec Brainerd. Drawing upon generations of traditional wooden boat building knowledge, Brainerd and his crew carefully restored the damaged hull. The repairs respected the original craftsmanship while ensuring the Betselma remained structurally sound for years to come. It was yet another chapter in a life already filled with resilience. By this point, the Betselma had become something far greater than a commercial vessel. She had become a familiar face in Camden Harbor. Residents watched for her each summer. Visitors photographed her from the waterfront. Artists painted her. Children waved as she departed the dock. Without anyone realizing it, the Betselma had quietly become one of Camden's unofficial ambassadors. She represented a way of life that was slowly disappearing. A reminder of when the harbor echoed not with pleasure craft but with diesel engines and gulls and the voices of fishermen preparing for another day at sea. Perhaps that's why so many people remember her so fondly. Not because she was the biggest, not because she was necessarily the fastest, but because she remained exactly what she had always been. Honest, hardworking, unpretentious. A wooden lobster boat doing the job she had been built to do. By the early 21st century, however, time had begun to catch up with her. Even the strongest of white oak cannot withstand the passing decades forever. The Betselma had survived storms, collisions, changing owners, and the constant demands of working on the sea. But like every wooden vessel, she would eventually face her greatest challenge. Not the ocean, but time itself. No matter how well a wooden boat is built, no matter how carefully she is maintained, time eventually catches up with her. By the early 2000s, the Betselma had spent more than half a century on the water of Penobscot Bay. She had weathered countless nor'easters. She had endured freezing winters and blistering summers. She had worked through fog so thick the shoreline disappeared. She had survived collisions that would have condemned many lesser vessels. Yet she remained exactly where she belonged, on the water, still working. For decades, Captain Les Bex had done everything in his power to preserve the old boat. He understood something that every caretaker of a historic wooden vessel eventually learns. You never truly own a wooden boat. You simply become the next person responsible for keeping her alive. Every spring meant another inspection, another plank, another frame, another coat of paint, another season of maintenance before the first passenger ever steps aboard. It was a labor of love, one that demanded patience, skill, and a little more than determination and grit. By then, the Betselma had become more than just another tour boat. She had become part of Camden itself. Visitors expected to see her tied up alongside the dock. Locals scarcely noticed her anymore, not because she wasn't special, but because she had always been there. She had become part of the landscape, like Curtis Island Lighthouse, like Mount Batty overlooking the harbor, like the windjammers sailing out each afternoon. The Betselma simply belonged. Generations of families stepped aboard her decks. Some had sailed aboard her as children, only to return years later with children of their own. Thousands of photographs were taken. Thousands of memories were made. Many visitors likely had no idea they were standing aboard one of the most unique wooden lobster boats ever built. To them, she was simply the Betselma. As the years passed, maintaining a large wooden vessel became increasingly difficult. The craftsmen who understood traditional wooden boat building were becoming fewer. The cost of materials continued to rise. White oak became harder to source. Experienced shipwrights grew older. The maritime world that had given birth to boats like the Betselma was slowly disappearing. Wooden working boats were giving way to fiberglass. Hand craftsmanship was increasingly replaced by mass production. An era was quietly coming to an end. Eventually, Captain Les Bex made the difficult decision that every wooden boat owner hopes to never face. It was time to retire. After 36 years of caring for the Betselma, he stepped ashore for one final time as her captain. With his retirement came another change in the boat's long history. The Betselma was sold to Camden Harbor Cruises, owned by shipwright Alec Brainerd, the same man whose craftsmanship had once repaired her after the collision with the Roseway. Another vessel, the Lively Lady II, was purchased alongside her. The Lively Lady II would continue carrying passengers around Camden Harbor. The Betselma would not. For the first time since entering the waters of Penobscot Bay in January of 1945, she was silent. No diesel engine echoed across the harbor. No wake spread behind her. No passengers climbed aboard. No lobster traps crossed her rails. She rested ashore, waiting. No one knew exactly what the future held. Some assumed she would eventually be restored. Others feared she might quietly disappear, as so many historic wooden boats had before her. For several years, she quietly waited. For several years, the Betselma remained ashore. She had survived storms, collisions, generations of ownership, and more than 70 years of hard work. Yet now she sat quietly waiting. Like so many historic wooden boats before her, it seemed possible that her story might come to an end in a boatyard. In 2016, Artisan Boatworks listed the Betselma for sale under a simple headline, "Help Save the Betselma." Although the advertisement drew attention from wooden boat enthusiasts, no lasting solution materialized. The old lobster boat continued to wait. Time, however, is rarely kind to a wooden boat sitting out of the water. Every passing season brought new concerns. The longer she waited, the greater the risk that another chapter of Maine's maritime history would quietly disappear. Then, in 2018, our stories crossed paths. At the time, I wasn't searching for the Betselma. I was searching for something entirely different. For years, I had dreamed of recreating Quint's famous shark fishing boat, the Orca, from Jaws. Finding the right boat proved more difficult than I had ever imagined. Most surviving lobster boats were either too modern, too heavily modified, too small, or simply no longer existed. The search eventually led me to Camden, Maine. It was there that I first laid eyes on the Betselma. At first glance, I saw what everybody else saw, an aging wooden lobster boat that had seen better days. But the more I studied her, the more questions I found myself asking. Who built her? Why was her hull so different from every other lobster boat I had examined? Why did so many people around Camden speak about her with such admiration? Those questions led me down a path I never expected. What began as a search for a movie boat quickly became a search for history. I started digging through newspaper archives. I tracked down former owners. I interviewed family members. I searched museum collections. Old photographs surfaced. Forgotten newspaper clippings emerged. Stories that had lived only in the memory began finding their way onto paper once again. Every answer seemed to uncover two more questions. The deeper I dug, the more remarkable the Betselma became. I realized that if I didn't document her history now, much of it would likely disappear forever. Many of the people who remembered Ralph Worcester and the Betselma firsthand were already well into their later years. Some passed while I was still conducting interviews. Others entrusted me with photographs and stories that had never been shared publicly. Those moments impressed something upon me. I wasn't simply restoring a boat. I had become the next caretaker of her history. Today, when people hear the name Betselma, they immediately think of the Camden tour boat. Some may even think of the Orca if they're aware of my project. And one day, that's exactly what she'll become, the Orca. But before being a Hollywood movie replica, before movie fans, before restoration, she was already something extraordinary. She was the life work of Ralph Worcester. She was the livelihood of Les Becks. She carried tourists through one of America's most beautiful harbors. She represented generations of Maine boat building at its finest. That is history worth preserving, and that is why this documentary exists. Today, the Betselma rests quietly, waiting for the next chapter in her remarkable life. Her working days may be over, but her story is far from finished. For more than 70 years, she faithfully served the people of Camden. She was built not in a factory, but by the hands of two brothers who believed in craftsmanship. She earned her living honestly, first as a hardworking lobster boat and later as a beloved sightseeing vessel, carrying thousands of visitors across the waters of Penobscot Bay. She weathered storms, survived accidents. She outlived countless boats built alongside her. Most importantly, she carried with her the lives of the people who called her home. The names Ralph Worcester, Fred Worcester, Marion Taft, Fred Bell, Alan Talbot, Les Becks, and so many others will forever be woven into the grain of her white oak timbers. A wooden boat is more than wood, iron, and paint. She becomes a record of every hand that built her, every captain who stood at her wheel, every fisherman who worked her decks, every family who stepped aboard, and every story she carried home to the harbor. That is exactly why preserving boats like the Betselma matters. Not because they're old, not because they are rare, but because once they are gone, an irreplaceable piece of history disappears with them. Over the past 6 years, I've had the privilege of gathering photographs, newspaper articles, documents, and memories from people whose lives were touched by this remarkable boat. Many of those voices are no longer with us. Their stories now live on through the history that they entrusted me to preserve. My hope is that this documentary has done justice to their memories. There are still many stories left to tell. The remarkable life of Captain Ralph Worcester, the unforgettable adventures of Marion Taft, the whispered tales of rum runners along the Maine coast, the mysterious encounter with the German U-boat during the closing months of World War II. Each deserves its own place in history. Those stories will come in time. For now, this has been the story of the Betselma, a little wooden lobster boat from Camden, Maine, built with pride, worked with honesty, preserved through dedication, and remembered because people chose not to let her be forgotten. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping preserve the legacy of the Betselma.